There's a version of this story you were told as a child. A gentleman in a burlap sack, barefoot, with a pot on his head, wandering the American frontier planting apple seeds. A saint of the wilderness. A folk hero who brought sweetness to the savage land. That version is a lie. Not entirely, of course. The best lies are built on fragments of truth, polished until they shine, until you can't see the blood underneath. John Chapman, the man they called Johnny Appleseed, did plant apple trees across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. But this isn't a story about agriculture. This isn't a story about a charitable eccentric who wanted children to have fresh fruit. This is a story about land. About power. About what happens when something ancient and patient meets something new and hungry. And about a sacrifice so profound, so fundamentally misunderstood, that it was buried beneath folklore and children's songs. The problem wasn't planting apples. The problem was where they grew. By the time you understand why that matters, you'll see Johnny Appleseed differently. Not as a saint. Not as a fool. But as something else entirely. Something the American myth machine couldn't quite digest, so it sweetened him, simplified him, made him safe for schoolchildren and state fairs. Listen closely. The wind through apple branches sounds different when you know what they're actually doing there. John Chapman was born in 1774, probably in Leominster, Massachusetts, probably to a family of modest means. The records are inconsistent. His mother died when he was young. His father fought in the Revolutionary War. These are the facts we have, and they're thin as water. What we know for certain is that by 1800, John Chapman had begun his strange migration westward. He moved like smoke through the territories, appearing in settlements, staying long enough to plant orchards, then vanishing into the forests for months at a time. He wore rags, sometimes a coffee sack with holes cut for his arms. His feet were bare and so calloused they looked like tree bark. He carried a leather bag filled with apple seeds collected from cider mills in Pennsylvania. People called him eccentric. They called him touched by God. They called him simple. He was none of these things. Johnny moved through the frontier like he belonged to it, not to the human world pressing westward. He slept outdoors in all weather. He talked to trees, or so witnesses claimed, though they could never quite hear what he was saying. He predicted changes in the weather with unsettling accuracy. He knew where water would rise before the spring thaws came. He appeared at homesteads hours before anyone knew they needed him. The settlers tolerated him because he seemed harmless. A wandering mystic was preferable to a wandering threat. And the trees he planted did grow, astonishingly well, in places where other crops failed. So they let him pass. They gave him food when he asked, which was rarely. They watched him disappear into the deep woods and wondered, briefly, if they'd see him again. They always did. But here's what they didn't notice, what they couldn't have noticed because they were too busy surviving, too busy clearing land and building futures. Johnny never planted randomly. Every orchard, every scattered grove, followed a pattern. A geometry the settlers didn't recognize because it wasn't theirs. The forest recognized it. The forest responded. Deer would graze near Johnny's trees but not damage them. Frost would kill crops in surrounding fields but leave his saplings untouched. Birds nested in branches that shouldn't have been strong enough yet. And if you walked through one of Johnny's orchards at dawn, when the mist hung low and thick, you'd swear the trees were breathing in rhythm, like sleeping lungs. People laughed about it. Pioneer humor. The strange man and his magic apples. But they didn't laugh too hard. Not when they needed the fruit. Not when they noticed how the land around Johnny's trees seemed calmer somehow, less hostile, more willing to be lived on. Johnny Appleseed was useful. And useful strange men are allowed their eccentricities. Until they're not. The thing you need to understand about early 19th century America is that it was a machine designed to convert wilderness into property. The Northwest Ordinance. The Land Act of 1800. Treaties made and broken with indigenous nations. It was systematic, legal, and absolutely ruthless. You could buy land for $2 an acre if you could prove you'd improved it. Improved meant cleared. Meant fenced. Meant made suitable for white agriculture and white settlement. The government wanted bodies on that land, wanted it claimed and defended, wanted it producing value that could be taxed. Into this system walked men who understood how to exploit it perfectly. His name was Cyrus Hale, though that might not have been the name he was born with. By 1810, Hale had accumulated over 40,000 acres across Ohio and Indiana through a combination of legal purchases, aggressive foreclosures, and strategic violence against squatters who couldn't produce clear titles. He employed surveyors, lawyers, and armed men he called land agents. He was building an empire in the territories, and he was doing it with the full blessing of state and federal law. Hale was handsome in the way powerful men often are, well-fed and confident, with eyes that calculated value in everything they saw. He dressed in fine clothes even in the rough frontier towns. He spoke elegantly. He donated to churches. He was, by all appearances, a civilizing force. He was also the kind of man who would burn a family's cabin while they slept if their claim interfered with his property lines. The settlers knew this. They spoke about it in whispers, in careful euphemisms. They said Hale was a hard man but a fair one. They said he followed the law. They said if you had clear title, you had nothing to worry about. They believed this because they had to, because the alternative was acknowledging that the system they trusted, the system that promised them land and prosperity, was designed to benefit men like Hale at everyone else's expense. By 1815, Hale owned so much land he rarely saw most of it. He operated from offices in Cincinnati and Columbus, directing his agents by letter, reviewing maps that showed his holdings expanding like an infection across the territory. He was patient. Methodical. He didn't need to steal land quickly. He could wait for people to fail, to miss payments, to die without heirs, and then he'd simply absorb their acres into his endless holdings. He wanted everything. And he was very close to getting it. Then his surveyors started reporting anomalies. Trees where their maps showed cleared land. Orchards on property that should have been empty. Apples growing on acres Hale had purchased from men who swore they'd never planted a seed. At first, Hale ignored it. Trees could be cut down. But the reports kept coming. His agents grew frustrated. The same groves appeared in multiple, overlapping claims. The same trees seemed to exist in places they couldn't possibly reach. Someone was planting on Hale's land. Someone who didn't respect property rights or legal boundaries or the natural order of American expansion. Someone who needed to be stopped. Hale asked for a name. His agents gave him one. Johnny Appleseed. Hale laughed. He'd heard of the eccentric wanderer, the simple-minded tree planter. He wasn't worried. Men like that broke easily when you applied the right pressure. Legal pressure. Economic pressure. Physical pressure if necessary. He had no idea what he was actually dealing with. The first time Cyrus Hale's men found Johnny Appleseed, they were surveying a tract near the Muskingum River that Hale had purchased from a failed settler named Whitmore. Whitmore had cleared 3 acres before his wife died of fever and he sold everything to Hale for pennies on the dollar. The surveyors expected to find those 3 acres empty, ready to be divided and resold. Instead, they found an orchard. 27 apple trees, young but healthy, arranged in a pattern that made no geometric sense. Not rows. Not a square. Something older than that, something that looked almost like a spiral if you squinted at it from the right angle. And sitting beneath the largest tree, weaving a basket from willow branches, was Johnny Appleseed. The surveyors knew who he was immediately. Everyone knew Johnny. He looked up as they approached, smiled that distant smile of his, and went back to his weaving. One of the surveyors, a man named Garrett, asked Johnny what he was doing on private property. Johnny said he was planting trees. Garrett explained that the land belonged to Cyrus Hale now, that Johnny had no right to be there. Johnny nodded as if this information was interesting but irrelevant, and said the trees had a right to be there, and that was what mattered. Garrett told him to leave. Johnny said he would, eventually. Garrett threatened to have him removed by force. Johnny looked at him with those strange, calm eyes and asked if Garrett had ever tried to remove a tree that didn't want to go. Garrett had no idea what that meant. He reported back to Hale that the man was clearly mad, harmless, and that the trees could be cleared whenever Hale wanted. Hale told him to clear them immediately. Garrett returned with 2 other men and axes. The orchard was empty. Johnny was gone. They began cutting the trees. The first tree fell easily enough, though Garrett later said it felt wrong somehow, like cutting into something alive in a way trees weren't supposed to be alive. The second tree took longer. The blade kept sticking. The wood seemed denser than it should have been. By the third tree, one of the men had cut his hand badly, though he swore he'd been careful. Blood soaked into the earth around the roots. They gave up after 4 trees. Told Hale the job was done. But the trees didn't stay down. Within a week, settlers reported seeing the orchard intact again. Different witnesses, different days, but the same story. 27 trees, arranged in that strange spiral. Garrett insisted he'd cut them down himself. He had the scars to prove it. But when he returned to check, there they were. Maybe not the exact same trees. Maybe new ones. Maybe the stumps had sprouted again, impossibly fast. Or maybe he'd been mistaken about where the orchard was. Hale studied the maps. They didn't match the reports. His surveyors had marked the Whitmore tract clearly, but the orchard's location kept shifting in the testimonies. 1/2 mile east. 2 miles north. On the other side of the river entirely. He sent more men. They found nothing. Or they found different orchards, planted on different claims, none of them the original. And every time they asked locals if they'd seen Johnny Appleseed, the answer was always the same. He'd just been there. He'd just left. He'd be back soon. Hale began to understand that this wasn't a problem he could solve with axes. In 1817, Cyrus Hale commissioned a comprehensive survey of all his Ohio holdings. He wanted clear maps, clear boundaries, clear documentation of exactly what he owned and where. He hired the best surveyors he could find, promised them bonuses for accuracy, and told them to note every structure, every field, every tree of significance. The survey took 6 months. When it was complete, Hale received a leather-bound volume with detailed maps and notations. And in the margins, again and again, his surveyors had written the same phrase. Appleseed orchard, origin unknown. There were 17 of them. 17 orchards that existed on Hale's land that no one could account for. Some were on property that had been empty wilderness when Hale purchased it. Some were on claims that had been cleared and resold twice. One was growing in the middle of what should have been a pine forest, with no cleared land around it, as if the apple trees had simply emerged between the pines without disturbing them. Hale burned the survey. Commissioned a new one from different surveyors. Told them to ignore any apple trees that couldn't be explained. The second survey came back cleaner. Fewer annotations. Fewer mysteries. But one of the surveyors, a young man named Thomas Merrick, came to Hale's office in Columbus before the job was finished. He looked exhausted. He said he needed to tell Hale something that wasn't going in the official report. Merrick said he'd seen Johnny Appleseed. Followed him into the woods after spotting him near a disputed claim. Watched him plant seeds in patterns Merrick didn't recognize, geometric but organic, like something between a map and a living thing. And when Merrick approached and asked what he was doing, Johnny had looked at him and said, marking what should stay. Merrick asked what that meant. Johnny said the land had agreements older than deeds, older than surveyors' chains, older than the men who thought they could own it. He said some land could be lived on, some could be borrowed, but some had to be left alone. He said the trees were reminders. Merrick asked, reminders for who? Johnny smiled and said, for whoever forgets. Merrick reported this to Hale and then, within a week, left Ohio entirely. Took his family and moved back east. When Hale's agents tracked him down months later to ask about discrepancies in the survey, Merrick refused to discuss it. Said he'd made a mistake. Said the whole thing was confusion and bad memory. Said he'd never seen Johnny Appleseed at all. But Hale noticed something. Other people who'd had direct encounters with Johnny, settlers who'd spoken with him, workers who'd tried to remove his trees, they were leaving too. Not all of them. But enough. And the ones who stayed stopped talking about it. If you asked them about Johnny Appleseed, they'd shrug, say they'd heard stories, but no, they'd never actually met him. Their memories grew vague. Uncertain. Hale began collecting documents. Letters from his agents. Deeds with unusual clauses. Claims that mentioned orchards not listed in original surveys. He kept them in a locked chest in his office. He told no one about them. And one night in 1819, the office burned. Not the whole building. Just Hale's private office. The fire started in the locked chest, or so the investigation concluded. Spontaneous combustion of old papers. Unfortunate but not suspicious. Everything burned. The documents, the maps, the letters. And in the ashes, investigators found apple seeds. Dozens of them. Scattered across the charred floor like they'd been planted there. Hale didn't rebuild the office immediately. He spent weeks going through what records had survived in other locations, trying to reconstruct what he'd lost. And he noticed something else. Gaps. Missing pages in ledgers. Deeds that referenced transactions he had no memory of completing. Signatures that looked like his but weren't quite right. His empire, his carefully documented empire, was developing holes. And through those holes, apple trees kept growing. By 1820, Cyrus Hale's problems had moved beyond the merely bureaucratic. His agents reported crop failures on land that should have been fertile. Wheat that grew stunted and bitter. Corn that rotted in the fields before harvest. But nearby, sometimes within sight of the failing crops, Johnny's apple trees thrived. They grew faster than they should have, bore fruit earlier than was natural, and seemed immune to the pests and blights that plagued everything around them. Settlers noticed. They started planting their own crops closer to the orchards. They started treating the trees with a superstitious reverence, leaving offerings of food or trinkets at the bases of the trunks, as if the trees were shrines. They stopped clearing new land near Johnny's groves, even when that land was legally theirs to develop. Hale's agents tried to enforce his claims. They brought contracts, brought witnesses, brought armed men when necessary. But something strange kept happening. They'd get lost. Not in the deep wilderness, not in uncharted territory, but on land they'd surveyed themselves. Men who'd walked the same trails 100 times suddenly couldn't find their way. They'd set out for a homestead and end up miles off course, turned around, confused. Some of them wandered for days before stumbling back to civilization, dehydrated and babbling about trees that moved, about orchards that appeared where there should have been open meadow. One of Hale's best agents, a man named Sutherland who'd successfully intimidated dozens of squatters off contested land, went into the woods to confront a settler who'd refused to recognize Hale's deed. Sutherland had 3 armed men with him. They never found the settler's cabin. They were discovered a week later, 15 miles from where they'd started, sitting in a circle around an apple tree, staring at the trunk. When rescuers asked what had happened, Sutherland said they'd been resting. Just resting. They'd only sat down for a moment. He left Hale's employment the next day. The stories multiplied. Tools that broke for no reason when used to cut Johnny's trees. Horses that refused to cross certain invisible boundaries. Rain that fell everywhere except on Hale's cleared fields. And always, at the edge of these strange occurrences, witnesses claimed to see Johnny Appleseed. Not doing anything. Just standing there, watching, his face expressionless and calm. Hale tried to dismiss it as frontier superstition, the kind of nonsense uneducated settlers believed to explain their own failures. But he couldn't dismiss the economic impact. His land was becoming worthless. Not because of anything he could fight in court, but because people were afraid of it. They wouldn't settle there. They wouldn't buy there. They whispered that Hale's holdings were cursed, that he'd angered something old and patient, that Johnny Appleseed had marked the land as forbidden. In 1821, Hale decided to confront Johnny directly. It took him 3 months to find him. Johnny moved constantly, never staying in one place more than a few days. But Hale was persistent, and he had resources. He tracked Johnny to a small orchard on the banks of the Scioto River, a grove of maybe 30 trees, perfectly healthy, heavy with early fruit. Johnny was sitting with his back against the largest tree, eating an apple. He looked exactly as every description had portrayed him, thin, weathered, dressed in rags, barefoot. He looked up as Hale approached and smiled politely, as if he'd been expecting company. Hale introduced himself. Johnny nodded, said he knew who Hale was. Hale asked, directly, why Johnny was planting on his land. Johnny said he wasn't planting on Hale's land. He was planting on the land's land. Hale said that was meaningless, that he had legal title, that Johnny was trespassing. Johnny took another bite of his apple and said the land didn't recognize Hale's papers. Hale said he could have Johnny arrested. Johnny said he could try. Hale said he could have every tree Johnny ever planted cut down and burned. Johnny looked at him with those unsettling calm eyes and said, "You could. But they'd grow back. And you'd keep losing things." Hale asked what that meant. Johnny said Hale knew what it meant. Said that taking what isn't yours has consequences. Said the land keeps accounts, and Hale's were very overdrawn. Hale told Johnny he was a madman, a nuisance, an obstacle to progress and civilization. Johnny finished his apple and tossed the core into the grass. He said maybe that was true. He said maybe civilization was the thing that needed obstacles. Then he stood, picked up his leather seed bag, and walked into the forest. Hale didn't follow. He stood there in that orchard for a long time, surrounded by trees that shouldn't have existed, feeling something he couldn't name. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something older than fear. The feeling you get when you realize you're being watched by something that was here long before you and will be here long after you're gone. He left the orchard intact. He told his agents to avoid it. And for the first time since he'd begun building his empire, Cyrus Hale wondered if he'd made a mistake. In the spring of 1823, Johnny Appleseed did something no one expected. He stopped planting. Not everywhere. Not completely. But the new orchards ceased appearing. The mysterious groves that had spread across Hale's holdings, that had marked boundaries and protected spaces, they stopped expanding. And Johnny himself became even more scarce than usual. Witnesses reported seeing him, but always at a distance, always moving away, never approaching settlements or homesteads. And then, in June of that year, Johnny walked into Cyrus Hale's office in Columbus. He was alone. Unarmed. He carried nothing but his leather seed bag, nearly empty. Hale's clerks tried to stop him, but Johnny walked past them as if they weren't there, opened the door to Hale's private office, and sat down in the chair across from Hale's desk. Hale, to his credit, didn't call for guards immediately. He studied Johnny for a long moment, this strange ragged man who'd haunted his business for years, and asked what he wanted. Johnny said he wanted to make an agreement. Hale asked what kind of agreement. Johnny said a simple one. He would stop planting. He would leave Hale's claimed lands alone. He would disappear from the territories entirely, move west beyond the frontier, and never return. In exchange, Hale would leave certain groves untouched. Specific orchards. Johnny produced a hand-drawn map from his seed bag, crude but detailed, showing 17 locations scattered across Ohio and Indiana. These orchards, Johnny said, had to remain. They were markers. Boundaries. They were keeping something in balance, though he didn't explain what. Hale looked at the map. The orchards marked weren't valuable property. Most were on land Hale had written off as too difficult to develop, too remote, too poor for agriculture. Leaving them wouldn't cost him anything materially. But it would mean acknowledging Johnny's terms. It would mean accepting limits. Hale asked what would happen if he refused. Johnny said nothing would happen to Hale personally. But the land would keep rejecting him. His holdings would continue to fail. The forest would keep reclaiming what he tried to take. He said Hale could fight it for decades if he wanted, spend his fortune and his life trying to impose his will on ground that didn't want him. Or he could accept that some spaces weren't meant to be owned. Hale made a decision. He agreed. They didn't sign a contract. They didn't shake hands. Johnny simply stood, left the map on Hale's desk, and walked out. Within a week, word spread through the territories that Johnny Appleseed had made a deal with Cyrus Hale. The details were vague, contradictory, but the basic fact was clear: Johnny had surrendered. He'd negotiated. He'd compromised with the man who represented everything wrong with frontier expansion. The settlers who'd treated Johnny as a folk hero felt betrayed. They said he'd sold out. That he'd chosen his own comfort over their protection. The orchards he'd planted became symbols of his failure, his cowardice. Some people cut them down out of spite. Some left them to rot. And Johnny, true to his word, disappeared westward. Reports placed him in Illinois, in Missouri, eventually in Iowa and the unorganized territories beyond. Always moving. Never settling. The legend of Johnny Appleseed began to sour. Oh, people still told stories about the gentle tree planter, still taught children about the man with the pot on his head, but those who'd lived through it, who'd seen what actually happened, they knew better. They knew Johnny had quit. Had given up. Had made his peace with the same forces of greed and violence he'd once resisted. Cyrus Hale kept his word. He left the 17 orchards alone. Not out of respect for the agreement, but because it was tactically convenient. The land they occupied wasn't worth fighting over, and leaving them intact made him look magnanimous, made him seem like a reasonable man who could compromise even with lunatics. His empire continued to expand. By 1830, he owned over 70,000 acres. He built a mansion in Columbus. He invested in canals and railroads. He became respected, admired, a founding father of Ohio's economic development. And if his land still seemed to resist cultivation in places, if crops still failed in certain fields, if workers still occasionally got lost in groves that shouldn't have confused them, well, that was just the cost of doing business on the frontier. Johnny Appleseed faded into obscurity. The legend persisted, but simplified, sanitized. The complicated truth of what he'd done, what he tried to do, got lost in sentimental retellings. And everyone assumed the story ended there. Everyone was wrong. Cyrus Hale died in 1847. He was 63 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and widely respected. He died in his sleep, peacefully, in his mansion in Columbus. His empire passed to his sons, who proved less competent at managing it. Within 10 years, much of the land had been sold off or lost to creditors. Within 20, the Hale name was barely remembered outside legal documents and property records. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what happened to the land itself. The 17 orchards Johnny had marked in his agreement with Hale, the ones Hale had promised to leave untouched, they remained. Through decades of development, through the transformation of Ohio from frontier to farmland to industry, those specific groves survived. Not because anyone particularly wanted to preserve them. They just persisted. When developers tried to clear them, equipment failed. When lumber companies attempted to harvest them, workers quit. When cities expanded around them, the trees remained as strange pockets of wilderness in otherwise urban landscapes. And the land those orchards marked, the land they protected, stayed healthy, fertile, stable. While surrounding areas suffered from soil exhaustion, from erosion, from the ecological damage of intensive agriculture, the ground around Johnny's trees remained vital. Scientists in the early 20th century studied the phenomenon, concluded the tree's root systems must be preventing erosion or enriching the soil somehow, but the data never quite made sense. The trees shouldn't have had that much impact. But they did. As for the land Cyrus Hale had cleared, the acres he'd claimed and developed, they began to fail in ways that compounded over time. Fields lost fertility faster than could be explained by farming practices. Foundations cracked in buildings constructed on Hale's former holdings. Wells dried up. The land seemed exhausted, used up, as if something vital had been extracted and never replaced. By the 1920s, economic historians studying Ohio's development noticed a pattern. Property that had once belonged to Cyrus Hale consistently underperformed compared to surrounding land. Not dramatically. Not enough to make headlines. Just persistently, stubbornly, across decades. And while economists attributed it to overuse or poor management, locals who'd lived there for generations knew better. They said Hale's land was cursed. They said he'd taken too much, pushed too hard, ignored warnings he should have heeded. They said Johnny Appleseed had marked the land against him, and the land remembered. But here's what very few people understood, what became clear only in hindsight: Johnny's sacrifice wasn't surrender. It was strategy. By agreeing to leave, by stopping his visible resistance, Johnny had removed himself as a target. Hale couldn't fight him anymore because there was nothing to fight. And without Johnny there as an adversary, as an explanation for Hale's problems, Hale had to confront the actual issue. The land itself. The 17 orchards weren't random. They were carefully chosen. They marked watershed boundaries, points where ecosystems converged, places where the land's vitality was concentrated. By protecting those specific locations, Johnny ensured that the larger region would survive whatever damage humans inflicted on it. The orchards were like seed banks, like genetic reservoirs, preserving something essential that could regenerate surrounding areas over time. It was brilliant. It was patient. It was the kind of strategy that only worked over decades, over generations. Hale thought he'd won. He'd gotten Johnny to leave, had gotten him to stop interfering. But Johnny had simply shifted his timeline. He'd stopped fighting a battle he couldn't win immediately and instead set in motion forces that would outlast Hale, outlast Hale's sons, outlast the entire structure of 19th-century land speculation. Johnny Appleseed wasn't a quitter. He was playing a longer game than anyone realized. There's a record, a letter discovered in 2003 in a collection of papers from a missionary who worked with indigenous communities in Indiana in the 1840s. The missionary wrote about meeting an old man who matched Johnny's description, living in a small cabin near the Wabash River. The missionary asked if he was John Chapman, the famous Johnny Appleseed. The old man smiled and said that was someone he used to be. The missionary asked why he'd given up his mission, why he'd made peace with men like Cyrus Hale. The old man said he hadn't given up anything. He said the trees were still doing their work. He said humans think in seasons, maybe years if they're wise, but trees think in centuries. He said he'd planted what needed planting, and now he was waiting to see what grew. The missionary asked what he was waiting for. The old man said, for people to understand that you can't own land. You can only borrow it. And if you forget to return it in the condition you found it, well, the land has ways of reminding you. The missionary never saw the old man again. The cabin was empty when he returned to check on him. But nearby, he noticed something. A young apple orchard. Maybe 20 trees. Arranged in a spiral pattern. Johnny Appleseed died in 1845, probably near Fort Wayne, Indiana, probably of pneumonia. He was 70 years old. He was buried in an unmarked grave, or in a pauper's cemetery, or not buried at all depending on which record you trust. His death was barely noted. No obituaries in major newspapers. No memorial services. He'd become a footnote, a peculiar character in the story of westward expansion, remembered more as a children's tale than an actual historical figure. But his trees lived. They're still living. If you know where to look, if you study the maps and land records carefully, you can still find them. Old apple trees, far older than they should be, growing in patterns that don't match modern orchard designs. Growing on land that seems healthier than it should be, given how it's been used. And if you talk to people who live near those trees, they'll tell you stories. About how the land feels different there. About how crops grow better. About how, sometimes, when the wind moves through the branches, it sounds almost like breathing. They'll tell you those places feel protected. And maybe they are. There's a version of Johnny Appleseed that exists in American mythology. A gentle saint. A barefoot wanderer. A simple man with a simple dream of bringing fruit to the frontier. We teach him to children. We put him in picture books and television specials. We've made him safe, made him cute, made him a symbol of pastoral generosity. That version is a lie we tell because the truth is too strange, too patient, too uncomfortable. The real John Chapman understood something that Cyrus Hale never could, that most of us still struggle to accept. The land isn't a possession. It isn't a resource to be exploited. It's a living system with its own intelligence, its own memory, its own sense of balance. And when that balance is disrupted, when humans take too much without giving back, the land responds. Not with violence. Not with dramatic retribution. But with persistent, patient resistance. Johnny didn't plant apple trees to feed people. He planted them as markers. As guardians. As reminders that certain spaces needed to remain wild, needed to remain untouched, needed to be respected on their own terms. The sacrifice everyone thought was his defeat, his compromise with Hale, was actually his victory. By removing himself as a visible threat, he allowed his real work to continue invisibly. The trees kept growing. The land kept remembering. And over generations, over centuries, that memory shaped what could and couldn't be done with the ground he'd marked. Cyrus Hale won every legal battle. He acquired vast wealth. He built an empire. And all of it crumbled slowly, inevitably, because he'd built it on ground that refused to support him. Johnny planted 17 orchards and changed the ecology of an entire region for generations. Tell me who actually won. The last confirmed sighting of Johnny Appleseed was in March 1845, near Fort Wayne. He was seen walking along the St. Joseph River at dawn, carrying his leather seed bag, heading north into territory that hadn't been surveyed yet. A witness called out to him, asked where he was going. Johnny turned, smiled, and said simply, "Wherever there's room." Then he walked into the morning mist and never came back. But here's the thing about apple trees. They live for 100 years if they're healthy, sometimes longer. And when they die, they drop seeds. And those seeds become new trees. And if those trees are planted in the right pattern, in the right places, they create networks. Corridors. Safe passages for animals, for water, for life to move through landscapes that humans have otherwise claimed. Johnny's trees are still spreading. Still marking. Still protecting. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just persistently, across generations, doing exactly what he planted them to do. There are places in Ohio, in Indiana, in Illinois, where apple trees grow wild in patterns no one can quite explain. Spirals. Geometric arrangements that look random until you see them from above. And in those places, the land thrives in ways that puzzle scientists and farmers alike. Some people say those are Johnny's trees, descendants of the orchards he planted 200 years ago. Others say that's impossible, that apple trees don't spread like that the patterns must be coincidence or the result of bird migration or wind dispersal. But the people who live near those trees, who've grown up in their shade, who've watched them survive droughts and storms and development that should have destroyed them, they know better. They know those trees are exactly where they're supposed to be. They know Johnny Appleseed is still planting, in some sense, still marking the boundaries between what can be taken and what must be left alone. In 2019, a development company in Ohio attempted to clear a tract of land for a shopping complex. The land had been empty for decades, considered too swampy, too unstable for construction. But new engineering techniques made it feasible, and the company had invested millions. During the initial survey, they found an old apple orchard. 27 trees, arranged in a spiral, their roots so deep and interconnected that removing them would have destabilized the entire water table for the surrounding area. The company tried anyway. Equipment malfunctioned. Workers quit. The project manager reported feeling watched whenever he visited the site, though he could never explain by what. After 8 months of delays and cost overruns, the company abandoned the project. The land was sold to a conservation trust for a fraction of its value. The orchard still stands. The trust's ecologist, studying the trees, found something interesting. The root system extended far beyond what should have been possible for trees that age. They'd created a network, a web of connections that held the soil together, filtered water, supported hundreds of species of insects and birds and mammals. The ecologist called it one of the most biodiverse locations she'd ever studied in Ohio. She called it a miracle of natural engineering. She had no idea someone had planned it that way 2 centuries ago. This is what Johnny Appleseed understood that we're only beginning to relearn. The land doesn't need to be conquered. It needs to be partnered with. Respected. Given space to do what it does naturally. And when you do that, when you plant with intention and patience and humility, the land responds. Not immediately. Not in ways you can measure in quarterly reports or election cycles. But over time. Over generations. In patterns that outlast empires and economies and the men who thought they could own the world. Johnny Appleseed faced a ruthless land baron. He faced a system designed to convert wilderness into property, to erase anything that couldn't be bought or sold or dominated. And he didn't fight it with violence or law or political power. He fought it with seeds. With time. With trust that the land would remember what he planted long after everyone forgot his name. The sacrifice everyone misunderstood wasn't surrender. It was faith. Faith that some things are more powerful than ownership. That some things can't be killed by axes or contracts or greed. That if you plant the right seeds in the right places, they'll grow long after you're gone, protecting spaces you'll never see, for people you'll never meet. Cyrus Hale's name exists only in property records now, in historical footnotes about early Ohio development. His wealth vanished. His empire dissolved. His legacy is dust. But somewhere in Indiana, in Ohio, in Illinois, in Iowa, apple trees are growing in patterns that look almost intentional. Almost planned. Almost like someone, 200 years ago, knew exactly what would be needed, exactly what would last, exactly where to plant reminders that the land is not ours to own. Some stories don't want to be remembered. They want to be respected. And if you walk through one of those wild orchards at dawn, when the mist hangs low and the world is quiet, you might feel it. That sense of being in a place that's protected. That's held. That's loved by something older and more patient than human ambition. You might see apples hanging heavy on branches, perfect and untouched, growing in soil that should be exhausted but isn't. You might hear the wind moving through the leaves, and it might sound, just for a moment, like breathing. And if you're very quiet, if you listen carefully, you might understand what Johnny Appleseed was really saying when he planted all those seeds. Not, "I own this." Not, "This is mine." But, "This will remain." And it has.